Do you guys think we're ready to get going?
Yeah, I think so.
Let's do it.
Awesome.
All right. Well, first of all, a huge welcome to everybody who's here. We are so excited to have this presentation and provide this wonderful information that we really feel will help a lot of families and a lot of people who are approaching the need to have a talk with their family members and their loved ones. So welcome. And if you have any questions at any point, you can just put them in the chat and we'll be monitoring the chat as well. So we can definitely follow up with your questions via email or a phone call if you so prefer. If you did not provide your address when you registered and you want us to send you a free workbook, please, you can do so in the chat privately to me. And this workbook is amazing. It will have all the copy of the slides that we will go over today, as well as a study guide that you can use to help you guide in your personal situations. We will also be sending out the recording of this presentation. So if you don't get that and you want it, make sure to reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat so we can always be in touch. The only other thing of business is that we will be asking you guys to fill out a survey, and the link will be in the chat. And this survey will be really, really helpful for us. So if you can take just a few minutes to fill it out at any point during this conversation, that would be really amazing. And then on the survey itself, at the very bottom, there's a little opportunity for you to put your name and contact information if you want us to reach out and continue to help you with any planning needs that you might have, any questions that that came up during the presentation, or if there's any other way we can help you, please put your contact information there and we can reach out to you after this presentation. So the Portland Elder Care Council, who we are an alliance of volunteers dedicated to helping our community deal with elder care planning issues. So we are here to help in any way that we can. So let us know if there's a situation or a resource that you want to be connected to. That is what we're here for. This is our wonderful council. We're made up of 6 wonderful ladies, and we all are very passionate about helping our seniors in our Portland community, as well as their family and their loved ones, to navigate the challenges of getting older. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Bess, who will get the presentation started. And Bess, take it away.
Thank you, Gromit, and good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, whatever it is. 4 o'clock is a weird time. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate that you took time out of your day to spend with us, especially about this topic. I know that some of you were present for our part 1 of the talk, and that was back in November. That event was geared towards helping seniors start this conversation around long-term care planning, questions that they might have. With part 2, we invited adult children to come. And the goal of this event is to really help adult children to communicate effectively with aging parents, grandparents, and friends, and really discuss some of the obstacles that are unique to you as adult children. So a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to discuss the obstacles to family communication. We discuss the obstacles that seniors might have. The obstacles are a little bit different for adult children. We're going to discuss a couple of community scenarios. So back in November, we talked about a specific community scenario from the mom's point of view. We're going to discuss it from her children's point of view. And then I'm also going to be sharing a personal experience from my own family. Jamie is going to walk us through some successful tips for family communication, what to do and not to do. And then we're going to finalize it with a very clear framework of how to write yourself an outline for effective communication. And just like Gromit has said at the beginning, this is an interactive presentation. We really want your feedback. We want to know what you are dealing with as our neighbors out in the community. So if you have questions, put them in the chat box. If you have something more immediate that you'd like to address, wave your hand. I'll look for you. And we definitely want to address it in time or afterwards if you want to have a more personal conversation with one of us. So let's get into this conversation about what the obstacles are. Now, like I said, some of the obstacles to family communication are going to be the same across the board. Others are very different depending on what side of the coin we're on. So for adult children or grandchildren who are looking to start a conversation around what the future looks like for their loved one, there are some very distinct issues. One being dealing with this role reversal that is suddenly taking place. And it does happen pretty gradually, but then one day it just kind of smacks you in the face and you're suddenly the major caregiver or decision maker sometimes in your family. And that can be really different to switch roles between as adult children and parents. Now, with that role reversal comes a great deal of anxiety and frustration about your parents' health. So that right there is the obstacle, is these negative feelings that start filling up in us because of this role reversal and anxiety around things that we don't really have any control over. Again, not feeling heard or listened to is the other obstacle. You might feel that your parent, your grandparent, your loved one does not want to have this conversation. You might feel that they're not open to reason, they're not willing to listen to you, and that really shuts down any future conversations that you feel could be had. Just like our part one, and this is why we're having this webinar event, is just trouble starting the conversation. What are the words that you choose to use to start this conversation? How do we get this off of the ground without putting a roadblock in the way? So that's usually the biggest one. Another issue is established family communication patterns and family dynamics. Now, everybody on the Zoom call has family dynamics. We don't have time to talk about them. We all have them. And those established family communication patterns really present a huge obstacle because you already anticipate the problems that your parent or your sibling might present because of their past communication patterns. So that definitely puts a roadblock. Now we've got the next obstacle is kind of like two ends of the spectrum. You might have members of the family, you've got too many people that want to be the decision maker. They want to be in charge. They want to be the one telling everybody what to do. There might be too many of those. Or you have everybody who doesn't want to take ownership of the situation. Nobody wants to take the lead and everybody's afraid of taking on responsibility. So sometimes we just don't have that middle ground that we really need to get the ball rolling. And just like last time in part one, we talked about forgetting the primary goal of what this conversation is about. Our primary goal is to ensure the best health, the best care, the best long-term solutions for the people that we love. And we can't lose that as our focus. It's not necessarily about who is right and who is wrong. It's what's best for the person we love. So keeping that in mind is definitely important. And one of the reasons that we wanted to have this webinar after the holidays is because a lot of times we see this every year after the major holidays of Thanksgiving and Christmas, and families usually visit, they start to see a decline that their parents or grandparents are having. And usually January, February is when we see a lot of these conversations starting. So that's why we felt like it was really appropriate to start this conversation now with you guys in the community. So one of the things that we wanted to ask you all is based on these obstacles, and I don't know, did we have the poll ready? I feel like I forgot to do the poll. You got it? Okay. So we're going to put a poll up here that lists all of these obstacles, and we'd really appreciate it if you guys could click one or all of them that you deal with in your family or in your role. or in the chat box, if there's something that you're personally dealing with that you don't see, type it in there for us. We really, like I said, we really want to know what you guys are personally dealing with. Click all to play. Seeing some answers. I know there's a lot of information here. And for most of us, we might be dealing with all of these. So if that's the case, that's not a problem either.
I'm trying to click more than one. It's only letting me do one. So I just chose
Okay.
my top one right now.
Thanks, Whitney. And I'm also not, because I'm screen sharing, I don't have my chat up. Has anybody popped anything in the chat box that I'm not seeing? Nope. Okay.
No.
So it looks like for the most part, the biggest issues dealing with the role reversal, trouble starting the conversation, and then the family communication patterns. That I think we can all definitely agree that those are pretty difficult. We'll see if anybody else wants to pop in there, but otherwise, I think we can end that whenever you're ready, Gromit. Trouble starting conversations looks like it's the biggest one. So, and I think this is an issue in every facet of life, starting difficult conversations, whether it's with your aging parents or somebody else. This is always going to be a difficult thing when there's something hard to talk about. So hopefully some of the tips that we share today, you're able to share in multiple aspects of your life.
So, point about also having family dynamics in the mix as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you're dealing with people's lives, there's a lot of issues. I'm going to pop this down. So we're going to go to our next slide here. So this is our community scenarios, and Jamie's going to pop in and help us here with these. These are real life scenarios. So Jamie, can I go ahead and have you take this one?
Yep. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Levin. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And what we're going to discuss now are a couple of real life community scenarios. The first one is a family that I actually work with, and Mary is a client of mine. Now, while I wasn't working with them at the time that all of this happened, I have heard various retellings of the events and know just how disruptive it was for the family. So community scenario number one, Mary is an 87-year-old woman who lives alone in a 2-story home in Portland. Recently, she was hospitalized due to a fall. Upon returning home, Mary's children, Mark and David, have noticed that Mary isn't as strong and able as she was before the fall. They also observed her having difficulty getting up and down the stairs in her home. For her safety, Mark and David want Mary to move to an independent living community. So I'm going to share a few ways that Mark and David might address this situation. And while I do that, I want you to keep in mind that these strategies I'm discussing can apply to a broad range of circumstances. For instance, you might be asking your parents to give up driving or begin to use a mobility device, or even to accept your help. So if we look at this community scenario and we simplify it, it is really a case where children have concerns about their parents' health and safety, and they need to express that to their mother with the goal of making a change. It is a very common example of a role reversal. There's a power shift in the family from Mary, the parent, the traditional holder of all of the power, to her sons as they begin to become more involved in making decisions for her and in her well-being. Now, role reversals, as all of you know, can feel very icky and uncomfortable because they're challenging the established rules, and they're also really disrupting the system. So it's quite natural for those involved to have a strong emotional reaction. For instance, in adult children, what we typically see are high levels of guilt, anxiety, fear about even initiating certain conversations with their parent. and certainly frustration if their parents are resistant to acknowledging a problem or accepting any form of help. Now, thinking about Mark and David, in preparation for their talk with Mary, I'd recommend they take the time for a bit of self-reflection to really understand how they're feeling about this situation, and then to do the simple exercise of identifying their emotions, pinpointing their specific concerns, and then writing that all down. Now, this process has two pretty clear benefits. The first one is that it will help reduce the intensity of those strong underlying emotions. So they're no longer just thoughts and feelings in their head and in their body. They now have a working document, something tangible to look at and to review. And secondly, it creates a script for them to really share these feelings and concerns with their mother in a more organized way. So once they have done that and have a firm grasp of how they feel and the list of their specific concerns, their next task is to try to understand and empathize with their mother's perspective. Mary had lived at her home for 30 plus years. She was very comfortable there. She also has a neighbor who's a close friend and a walking buddy. And like many older adults, she wanted to remain in her home as long as possible. That seems quite reasonable. Now, the benefit of empathizing with Mary is that it helps Mark and David become less entrenched and rigid in their ideas of what's best. And then it starts to open them up to more creative solutions and finding a compromise. I'd also encourage the boys to ask Mary to do the same during their conversations, right? To empathize and understand their position. And that might look like, perhaps Mark saying, Mom, how would you feel if you were in our situation? Or, Mom, please imagine what this is like for us. It's really hard. We're worried about you and we want to help. This approach really helps soften the other person's position too. And again, it allows for negotiation and room for finding solutions. Another part of what makes this situation so challenging, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this with your aging parents, is there are misaligned priorities. Most adult children, as in the case with Mary's, care almost exclusively about their parents' health and safety. If we could keep them in a bubble to protect them, I think we just might. And so our goals outside of that as adult children are to reduce the risks of potential accidents and injury. Now, while Mary's sons prioritize her safety, Mary ranks her independence, her comfort, and even her privacy to some extent higher than her safety. And we know this because she's willing to take the trade-off of increased risk of a fall in order to be able to stay in her home. So you can kind of see how this conflict arises from these differences in preferences. And this is really important to identify because the goal should be to find overlap in preferences, right? And using that overlap as a starting point to come up with potential solutions. So what ended up happening in this family, you might be wondering, is that Mark and David tried the approach of pressuring Mary to move. This went back and forth for months, and she simply refused. And she would dismiss their concerns and say things like, I'm perfectly fine. I just got out of the hospital. I'm getting stronger every day. Stop worrying about me. And I think she even said once, leave me alone. And after many months of the tension and conflict and difficult conversations, a family friend finally put them in touch with the home safety specialist. And the three of them talked about it and agreed to hire this professional and have a home safety evaluation. From that, Mary's house was evaluated and a report generated, which detailed specific safety concerns and then related recommendations. Mary and her sons each received a copy of the report, and it ended up being a very unifying experience for them because they were able to come together and review this list and then make decisions on which recommendations to implement. What ended up happening is that together they decided, okay, we're going to add an emergency response system. That was an easy one, so that Mary could click a button in the event of an accident and her sons would be notified. They also decided to install, I think, railing in certain strategic places in the house so that she had less difficulty moving about in her home. And fortunately, these minor home tweaks really addressed her son's concerns and made them feel more comfortable with her being alone in her home. It also made Mary very happy because she was able to stay at her home longer. Now, this scenario ended very favorably. And I will say not all family disagreements result in such harmonious solutions, right? And if you're finding yourself at a standstill with your parents about their health and their care, and you just can't come to a resolution, maybe it's time to think about bringing in a pro, right? There are geriatric care managers or senior advisors who can help navigate these complicated situations, and they even can mediate and provide solutions as well. And in those really difficult situations where you cannot find an outcome that makes everyone happy, or it's not really in your budget to hire an expert, I would suggest, and this is really for your own sanity, you might want to consider another option called radical acceptance. This is a psychology term. And by that, I mean accepting the reality of the situation, which is that your parents make choices that you just don't agree with. And you may never be able to change their mind or behavior. And perhaps the only control that you do have is over your mindset and finding a way to be more comfortable in accepting that fact. Just as a very quick disclaimer, some of the strategies I talked about for Mark and David really assume that Mary has full cognitive capacity. And in situations where the older adult has cognitive impairment, these approaches may not hold up. And we would always recommend working with a geriatrician who would give specific medical advice based on your loved one's circumstances. Now, if you do think there may be decline in your parents' reasoning or cognition, in the next week or so, as Gromit mentioned, we'll be sending out a workbook with this presentation and other materials, including a checklist of potential signs of cognitive impairment that was created by a geriatrician. Now, this isn't for diagnostic purposes. We're not trying to make you like mini doctors out there. It's really just informational so that you know what to be looking for and when it's time to consult with a doctor. I will also say, if you are in search of more resources or even of referrals, please do reach out to us at the Portland Elder Care Council. We have loads of educational information, all of it's free, and we are always happy to help and even connect you to local professionals. So next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to take a look at another community scenario. This, as Bess mentioned, is actually a personal one for her. It involves the planning discussions for her grandparents and managing many family members and different opinions. So here we go. Bess has a large extended family, and her maternal grandparents, 84 and 86 years old, are divorced. Her mother, aunts, and uncles, 6 siblings total, were struggling to start the conversation around planning for long-term care. All the siblings felt the parents would be resistant to the conversation, and they struggled with established family communication patterns. So you'll see there are several questions on this slide, and Bess is going to be answering each of those in detail as she discusses her family situation. So I'm going to let her take it from here.
Thank you, Jamie. And thank you for so clearly explaining the last community scenario. Very helpful. So yes, this personal experience is fairly recent. It really started back in September, October of this last year. I was having several conversations with my mother around both of my grandparents' care, and she was having quite a bit of frustration, feeling like she bore the brunt of a lot of responsibility in their care, even though there are 6 siblings total that live within a few minutes of each other. And so I said, well, have you talked to your siblings about this? And she said, absolutely not. Like, that wouldn't get anywhere. So I said, well, I think we need to start having this conversation. And assuming that everybody's not going to be on board is already creating obstacles to Grandma and Grandpa's care. So with her permission, I took this role on and I called each of my aunts and uncles individually and expressed some of the concerns I had and explained here, I live pretty far away, so I'm not able to care for them in the way that I normally would, but I'd like to be involved in their long-term care. And these are some questions I have. Are you guys open to having a family meeting about it? 100% everybody wanted to have the family meeting. Everybody was afraid. The biggest challenge that everybody had was they were concerned if they were the one to start the family conversation, that the other siblings would feel like they were taking over or pointing fingers or saying that other family members weren't helping to bear the responsibility of this care. And the other challenge that they felt really strongly about is that both of my grandparents would be really resistant to this conversation and it wouldn't go anywhere. So once I had everybody's agreement on that, I decided on a few things without asking anybody's permission. So I decided, first of all, that my grandparents would not be included in this first conversation. I felt from my previous experience dealing with families that it was more important for all of the siblings to be in harmony and on board, and then they could present a clear, unified consensus to my grandparents. And that would alleviate a lot of the resistance that my grandparents had going into this conversation. So I picked a day, sent out a Zoom link, and then I emailed each of my family members an outline of what we planned to talk about, what my top 3 concerns were with my grandparents' care, and invited them to address their own concerns. And this conversation went so smoothly, like my heart felt so full when it was done, because you could tell it was what everybody wanted, and everybody had the opportunity to clearly express their concerns without those established family communication patterns getting in the way. And you could tell that everybody really wanted the best for my grandparents. So at the beginning of the conversation, I made it very clear that this was not about finger pointing and this was not about somebody being in charge. This was about mitigating stress and alleviating difficulty for the family later on. We wouldn't be able to anticipate every crisis, but if we could start a conversation when crisis does come up with my grandparents' health, everybody would be on the same page. So there was a couple of things. The biggest one that we took care of right away was getting power of attorney finalized for each person. And we assigned 2 siblings to go to each grandparent, discuss why this was so important to get this finalized, bring the paperwork, and have a very clear conversation. One of the obstacles that my grandparents had was they didn't want any of the other siblings' feelings to be hurt if they chose somebody else to be power of attorney. So we made sure that each of the assigned siblings made it very clear that nobody's feelings would be hurt. Everybody was still going to be involved in the care, but that this needed to be decided for the safety of everyone moving forward. There was a couple other pieces that we talked about, but we agreed moving forward to use a family platform where all of my grandparents' doctor's appointments and other important appointments would be noted. Everybody would have access to it, and the responsibility of taking them to these doctor's appointments and clearly communicating what was said could be shared with the family, because some of the brothers and sisters felt like they didn't know what was going on medically with my grandparents. And I'm the organizer for all of that. So I maintain the family platform and I make sure that family communication is clear. So far, this is working very well. It's going to be an ever evolving situation, but the fact that we got that one big conversation out of the way and everybody feels more at ease talking to one another really made all the difference. And the other thing you'll be happy to hear is that both of my grandparents were so relieved when they were approached by my aunts and uncles about this subject. They had been wanting to finalize this for a very long time, but again, they were worried about hurting feelings and they weren't quite sure the steps to take that would keep them in control of what they still wanted. So we made sure to assure them that deciding this in advance kept them in control of their lives for as long as they possibly could. So I'll keep you guys posted if any other family drama ensues, but hopefully it's all good. But by a show of hands, between the scenario that I shared and what Jamie shared, can any of you relate to these family scenarios that we have shared today? Is this something you've dealt with? I see a hand there. Thank you. I think, yeah, thank you. I think we all know that we're dealing with this, and each family situation is unique. That's the thing, but where it's not unique in that you're the only one dealing with it. So while we want you to, like Jamie said, we really want to be a resource for you here with the PECC. We know that your family situation is unique, but you're also not alone in having to deal with this as a family. Any questions before we move on? Before, I don't want to like sidetrack anybody. Anything in the chat box? Great. You're a great audience. Thanks, guys. So here, this is a similar slide that we had in part 1, but it still is very applicable. Is you need to find someone that you are comfortable starting this dialogue with. In the family, for instance, in my family, I'm the person that people talk to about what's going on in the family. I hear what everybody feels about everyone, and everyone in everybody's family has somebody like this. So if that's a person that if there's somebody in your family that you think everybody would be willing to listen to or to start this conversation, approach that person and ask if they would be willing to be someone to start this dialogue with everyone. You might have a friend or neighbor that has known your family for years and it often weighs in on family discussions. That person could be part of this dialogue. A member of your church. Oftentimes a doctor can start this conversation and saying like, we need to talk about making some changes, and that might facilitate more of a conversation with your adult parent. And like Jamie said, sometimes bringing in a professional, a geriatric care manager, a senior advisor, someone that works in mediating family conflict and conversation. But the real key here, and Jamie touched on this before, and she's going to touch on it again, is really writing down your objectives, your goals, and how you want to express your feelings. That might seem very simple and easy to do, or you might think in your head, I know what I want to say, but writing it down and practicing it with somebody you trust will allow you to be very clear in your position and not get sidetracked by other family issues that don't really have any bearing on the current situation. Role playing, we sometimes poo-poo role playing, but role playing and practice are so key. We practiced for this presentation. It might not seem like it, but we did. And that practice is incredibly helpful in feeling like you're expressing yourself clearly and not going off on a tangent and feeling comfortable with the conversation. Conversation has to be clear and transparent for it to be effective. So we're gonna go on to our next slide here, and this is where Jamie is gonna give us our tips for really successful family communication. And this one's pretty fun, so listen up.
All right, gang, thanks, Bess. And actually, I do not poo-poo role playing. As a former psychotherapist, you do a lot of role playing, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, it's incredibly helpful for people to take a practice run before you go live. So in any event, so here's just a couple of tips on successful communication. I always review, this is a personal list that I've had for a number of years, and I actually typically review it before I have a difficult conversation. It's just a really good, helpful refresher. The first one is always leading with empathy and trying to understand where the other person is coming from. I touched on this in community scenario number 1, but empathy is really critical in building a strong connection because it helps us know the other person and their position. And one of the best ways to be empathic is by imagining yourself in the other person's shoes. What would that feel like for you? How might you respond similarly? And if you cannot imagine what your family member or parent is going through, then just ask them, right? What's this like for you, Dad? Tell me what you're feeling right now. Trying to understand someone's perspective shows so much respect and regard for them, and it makes you both feel more connected to each other, and it helps that conversation go a bit better. The next tip here is to listen and validate. Both are just crucial to effective communication and also maintaining healthy relationships. When I say listen, I mean wholeheartedly being present and actively hearing the other person with your full attention. Validation means, we all know this, right? It's recognition, acceptance, and acknowledgement of the other person's feelings. It's a way of communicating to that person that I see you, I hear you, and I understand you, even though we might not agree. When you combine strong listening with validation, it opens that person up to be more vulnerable and to compromise. Next, it's good practice to understand your loved one's goals and priorities. This is important information to gather so that you know what your parent wants out of the situation, what they deem to be important. And this allows you to discover if there's any overlap in your goals and ultimately to find common ground. Another really important part of effective communication is knowing your audience. Part of this includes adjusting the way you communicate. All of us on the PECC work with older adults, and we understand that with this population, it's important to speak clearly, slightly slower than usual, and please don't do that in an exaggerated and insulting way, but also to enunciate. And so those make the conversation go a little bit easier if the individual can hear and understand you. And the last tip is be direct, be honest, and be specific. Part of human nature is to avoid conflict and hurting someone's feelings. And one common mistake I observe with families and clients is that they are vague or passive to the point that their message is lost and can even be confusing. So it's better to state how you feel, give specific examples, but always try to do so with tact and a dose of kindness. So we're going to go next slide, please, Bess. So here are a few reminders of what not to do. First one is don't start a hard conversation if you've been running around all day or after a particularly hard day at work. For instance, around the holidays, I always recommend do not have the talk on Christmas Day or even Christmas Eve. There's generally a higher level of stress the day of or the day before celebrations. People are busily preparing a big meal. There's a lot to do and a lot going on. I'd recommend postponing that conversation until afterwards and just really trying to enjoy the holiday or event with your family. The next one, avoid using the terms you need to do this or shoulds. Not many people enjoy being told what to do. And small corrections to your word choice, like I think, or have you thought about doing this, make an enormous difference in their impact and how they're received. This one's really fun. Avoid referencing old issues or past behavior. Don't dig up old family arguments or disagreements from 20 years ago, right? Do not remind your mother of how she was withholding or not emotionally present or left you at school for 6 hours during your childhood. That has an almost 0% success rate of being helpful or additive to the conversation. So just remember, stick to the topic and leave the baggage at home. This last one is so incredibly important, and I cannot stress it enough. Please don't delay the talk with your parents until absolutely necessary. It is really to your benefit to help them plan ahead and think about their future. It also allows them to stay more in control of the process. Alternatively, and we see this a lot, if you don't have a plan in place, there's a chance that something will happen and you will be the one having to make decisions on your parents' behalf. And that is much more sticky and complicated and harder to do than just executing their wishes. So, all right, that is all for me. I hope that these ideas have resonated with you and you found them useful. Now I'm going to pass it along to my fellow council member, Mariah, and she's going to present a framework that will help you organize your conversations with family members.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. So we're going to be going through this framework here shortly, but I want to just premise it with that a lot of this information that we're going to be going through next actually came from a book called Fierce Conversations by Susan Scott. She has a very eloquent way of helping you have these difficult conversations and really set yourself up for success to be effective with them. Some of this information is probably going to sound redundant or repetitive because we've touched on a lot of this today, but it's redundant and repetitive because it's important. And so the more you hear it, the more it's probably gonna sink in. So first off, reiterating with what both Jamie and Bess said, is making sure to take time to practice your message and the opening statement that we're going to be going through here shortly. Don't feel bad about actually writing your script out and actually having your paper there and reading it. It's going to make sure that you're able to have that clear, concise, direct conversation that you're going to need to have with your loved one. And the other thing is to try to avoid these 5 major errors. Now, Jamie touched on a couple of these, but Susan does a great job of summarizing them. So the first error, and I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because we touched on them in part 1, and you'll also be receiving them in your book. So the first error is so how's it going? This kind of opening is often associated with a hidden agenda. And so people can usually smell that from a mile away. So it's best to be very direct when you're opening that conversation. The second error is what's called the Oreo cookie. Many of us have been taught to begin a confrontation or a difficult conversation with a compliment and then slip in the real message and then tidy it up with another compliment. I don't know about you, but I've definitely been had the experience of this before. And this really has taught us to expect to receive some bad news after receiving a compliment, and can usually cause anxiety. And the situation that we're trying to talk about, the last thing that we want is anxiety in the person that we're speaking to. The third error is too many pillows. And this approach is basically used to soften the message in hopes of lessening the impact and hurting or causing discomfort to the deliverer and the receiver of the message. But as Jamie alluded to earlier, this passive way of talking a lot of times doesn't allow the actual message to come through. The fourth error is called writing the script. Many of us have the tendency to script in our minds what we think someone will say or do if we bring up a certain topic. And it's natural to kind of anticipate a reaction, but it can also be a big problem because when we script what other people are saying, and what we think that they're going to do prior to a conversation, we can be so locked in and focused on that when the response is different, we don't actually notice it. And then the fifth error is Machine Gun Nelly. And I'm sure we all know this person, but this is the person that confronts with heavy artillery. They're very often afraid of confrontation, and they pretty much walk in and hurl the message into the room, often in a very offensive manner, and then leave the room before surveying how much damage is done. And then they completely black out the entire situation. That's not going to be helpful for anyone. So please, as you're putting together this framework or this conversation, if you're having one, don't be Machine Gun Nelly. So now getting into the next slide here, actually preparing your opening statement. So this is something like Jamie and Bess have alluded to, making sure you're taking time to practice and thoroughly write out what it is that you want to say. So when we're preparing this statement, Susan says that these really should be no longer than 60 seconds. We really want to be clear, concise, direct, and short to open up that conversation and then allow us to develop that hard conversation from there. So the first point of preparing an opening statement is naming the issue. Talk about this is where you're going to state what you want to talk about. Bess alluded to making sure you're very conscious about your word choice, and Susan definitely reiterates that, and it makes a big difference, the words that you choose to use as you're presenting and preparing the statement. Just for a minor difference, you know, when people think about the talk, or anytime someone says to you, hey, I want to talk to you, or we need to talk, that never entices a good feeling, right? So, but even just shifting the word, I want to talk to you, to I want to talk with you, it's a lot more opening and letting the person know that this is going to be a conversation that they're going to get to participate in. The second piece of putting together this opening statement is selecting a specific example, making sure that it's not too long ago, but not super recent, but something specific that you're going to be able to allude to while you're presenting this opening statement. And then making sure too that you're describing your emotions about this issue. Make sure you use the words that I feel. This is going to create a little bit more authenticity and invite someone else to also open up about their feelings when it's time for them to respond. The fourth item is making sure that you're clarifying what is at stake. This is really kind of the meat and potatoes of what is it that you're worried about? Why are you having this conversation? And making sure that you're putting that in a spot where it's very clear and direct, so it doesn't get muddled or lost. The fifth item is identifying your contribution to this problem. We all know that it takes two sides, or win a war, or to play a war essentially, and making sure that you recognize what your participation has been in this situation, again, is going to create a little bit more comfort, and also taking accountability in your part and your role in that. The sixth is indicating your wish to resolve this issue. Simply even stating, I want to resolve this issue, the effect that X is having on Y. There may or may not be an issue to resolve, because this is a pretty general framework and outline due to this being somewhat of a business book, but the framework is very helpful in general just for having those fierce conversations. And then the last point is making sure that you're inviting your partner to respond. So after you've said your opening statement, making sure you turn it around to them to be able to say, I want to learn your perspective, what's going on from where you're at. And then once you give them time and you've given your opening statement, then it's time to be quiet and just listen and let them speak, and be present and active in that listening, so you're able to hear what it is that their concerns and problems are. And if they try to derail you, having this opening statement written out will also help you bring that conversation back around in the event that they keep trying to go off down different rabbit holes. So having, like Bess and Jamie both said, having those notes to be able to, if people try to go off, you're able to bring them back. So I did prepare an example for me and my personal situation that I wanted to share, so I could kind of lay out an example of what this looks like. This is something I'm actively practicing, so please don't judge, because by no means is this probably going to be perfect, but I wanted to make sure that you guys had kind of an example of what that opening statement should look like, and it might be a little bit longer than 60 seconds. So when I prepared this, to give you guys kind of a backstory, it's in having the conversation with my dad. He's still fairly young, he's only 65, but I'm in an industry where I'm seeing the impact and the need and the importance of planning early. And so this is like a very initial conversation, trying to get him to think into the future when he still thinks he's invincible, and this is never going to be something that he needs. So a little bit different than the other two community scenarios. So the issue, Dad, I want to talk with you about the effect your minimal long-term care plan may have on our family. A few months ago, when I was home visiting, I tried to bring up the topic of long-term care with you, and you disregarded my desire to talk about it. You said if things got that bad, I should just take you out back and put you out of your misery. Side note, this is a very common response when you try to have this conversation. I feel worried and saddened by this approach. Our family has been directly impacted by needing to care for family members, and you have seen the toll it has taken on you, my sister, me, your brother, your wife, on an emotional and financial basis. The time, stress, and financial impact is life-changing. Average in-home care costs are over $4,500 per month. And even though you have good income, those costs could leave you or Kelly barely enough to live on. Your desire for how you want to be cared for also may not be possible if we don't create a plan now. I recognize my contribution to this issue in that I may not have presented available solutions or discussions in a way that created a safe place for a fluid conversation around the topic, as I was, maybe trying to tell you what to do. Sorry about that. I love you so much and have seen how this has impacted our family before. So I get passionate about making sure you and my stepmom will have the life you continue to want and be in the best possible position for if something like this happens. I want to be able to identify a long-term care solution for you guys that makes sense for our families and that everyone feels good about and can instill some peace of mind to ensure if you guys experience some form of long-term care event, our families won't have financially devastating impacts. I want to learn your perspective. What has prevented you from being open to seriously having this conversation and preparing a solid plan? So, end scene. As you can see, like, it's that conversation is very direct. It's definitely uncomfortable, but not confrontational. And that's what's going to be very important with this, especially because talking about this kind of stuff, you can get very emotional, and making sure that you keep those emotions on an even level, so a confrontation doesn't arise out of it. So that example and this framework will be printed in your workbook. So make sure if that's something you're interested in, we have all your appropriate contact information. And then from here, I'm going to pass it over to Bess to close us out.
Thank you, Mariah. That was really helpful. And we've come to the end of our program for tonight. Again, we want to thank you so much. And while we're at the end of this education piece today, we know that this is not the end of the journey for any of you and what you have ahead of you. So while we were able to share some really practical tips today, we also know that each of your situations is unique, and we really invite you to reach out to us here at the Portland Elder Care Council. Like was said at the beginning, we are volunteers in it with this council. We are here to support and be a good resource for you and your family moving forward. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us in the future. And Gromit is going to share a way that you can reach out to us.
Yeah, so over in the chat, you'll see a link to our Surveymonkey evaluation and information request form. And this will, if you guys can go ahead and click on it, you'll see that the first part is an evaluation part of the workshop that we did today. And at the very bottom, if you want us to reach out to you, whether it's via email or phone number, you can go ahead and provide that information, and we will follow up with you in the next coming days or whenever you say is the best time for us to do so. And we can continue this conversation as well as help you in your personal situation. So go ahead and take a few moments. It should only take 2 or 3 minutes top to fill out that survey. So go ahead and click that link, and we greatly appreciate it.
Gromit, do we have time if anybody has a question or two while everyone's filling that survey out?
We have about 3 minutes until it's 5 o'clock. So if anyone has questions and wants to take a few moments to ask that, we have time for about one question.
If there aren't any questions, I did want to, some of you probably have already seen this if you registered on our website, but we have another workshop planned for any of you that would like to join next month in February. We have a fall prevention webinar that will be presented by our very own council lady, Melissa. So we're really looking forward to that one, which dovetails off really nicely what Jamie said about what worked for her client in the home evaluation, home safety evaluation. So that could be really helpful for some of you in determining what the next steps might be for family care. So we hope to see you guys next month too.
If anyone has been here to our website, you also know we have an awesome newsletter that if you want to receive, it's a monthly newsletter. You only get 1 email a month, and you can sign up on our website as well. So it has a ton of good information. If you want to be up to date with any of the workshops, the free workshops that we put out, that's a good way to stay in touch, as well as good up to date. We post articles and lots of really good information. So if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe on our website. And that about does it for time. So we want to thank everybody for being here today. It was our pleasure and our honor to be here to provide this information and to be a resource for you guys. So thank you so much. And we hope that you guys have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.